Now, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Owen J Brown from Pure Fitbaw. Owen, how are you getting on?
I'm very well, Enda. Thanks. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. So we're nearing the end of a bit of a weird season in Scottish football. We'll talk a little bit about that
Hmm.
a little later on, and about Celtic and about Rangers, and maybe about the approaching Euros that is potentially not going to happen in certain countries, but Scotland are involved, and that's all that matters. So, but before we get into that, Pure Fitba, I was practicing my pronunciations because my Scottish
That's
brethren
good.
would give out to me otherwise. But how did it come about? What is it? Tell us a little bit about it and
Sure.
what you guys do.
Absolutely, Enda. So pure football, I guess, would be football content which aims, as its kind of guiding principles, to be unbiased, in depth, and Scottish. So kind of a lack of bias, attempting to always be objective, critical, without being hateful, appreciative, and kind of enthusiastic about the game without being sycophantic. And I think quite a wide range of Scottish football fans really appreciate that. We try and be in depth, doing research, really kind of digging into the detail, but hopefully being still quite concise and fun, whether that's match analysis or discussion of transfer targets or having maybe a level of knowledge that I think people might feel they don't get from maybe some of the more traditional or mainstream sections of football
Mhm.
media in Scotland. And finally, kind of in terms of principles, we're Scottish. So hopefully in a way that isn't parochial or self-obsessed, but in a way that kind of respects and focuses on our game, but also has a kind of outwards looking eye. There's no reason, in my view, that a kind of Scottish brand shouldn't be commenting on events and matches in European or world football too, rather than our content in Scotland of that sort essentially coming from England. And I kind of got involved about 3 years ago when a friend and former colleague Gavin Miller was setting it up. And initially, it was just a website with articles, and I tended to be the editor for that. Plus, there was a Twitter account that Gavin ran. Then we added a podcast about 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago. And since then, the kind of social media side of things has grown quite extensively. We've added more podcast shows. We've added some live video content, including a kind of pure goal show on a Twitch Saturday afternoon thing, and lots of kind of pretty cool opportunities have come about as a result. Gavin's now doing recruitment work within the game, and I've commentated for the SFA on a Scotland under 21 match, just as kind of examples. And it's been really nice kind of seeing the audience grow and interact with us, and seeing some of them create their own content. And for us to be able to grow the kind of team at Pure Fitball, and for me also, I guess, trying not to be sycophantic here, but just seeing the kind of general rise of other smart kind of non-traditional football media content, such as like your own work with, for example, the Huddle Breakdown.
Mm.
So yeah, that's kind of Pure Football and how it came about and where we are now. Yeah, and
Yeah, unbiased and Scottish is not
mm,
something that you would generally put two and two together, because like many big leagues, and especially leagues that are dominated by big teams, you're going to have media that's going to be covering it, and you're going to have the fans from the two big clubs saying that they're biased against you, regardless of whether you'd have Celtic and Rangers fans saying that the media is biased against both of them. Well, it just can't be that like that. How do you find separating that? Because Celtic and Rangers obviously have two of the biggest, most intense, and most online active fan bases in probably world football as well.
yeah, I think it's difficult. You're absolutely right, Enda, that both of those groups of people would feel at certain times that there's bias against them, and who am I to say how somebody should feel? I think you've just got to really be objective, in yourself, and be confident about your reasons for feeling certain things, and really make sure that you kind of can be that kind of balanced view. By being balanced, I think also people appreciate that being balanced doesn't mean not being critical. And again, I think that helps. If you can kind of show that if there's issues or flaws in either club, it's not just about kind of shying away from it and kind of, I think sometimes maybe when people are trying to do some content in Scottish football out of fear that either Celtic or Rangers fans will see them as biased, they maybe shy away from it and kind of don't kind of just offer their opinions. I think if you offer your opinions and they're balanced and in depth and there's knowledge behind them, I think hopefully most kind of rational Celtic and Rangers fans, and I do believe there are plenty of those on either side, will probably give you your dues.
Yeah,
That's the hope anyway.
yeah. The problem with, I think, a lot of the traditional media, and why I suppose the more intense supporters are moving away from it, is because at times it feels like they're poking the bear, like they're poking it purposely in order to get the response that they want. And I suppose that brings me on to my next point about Scottish football and covering it. Obviously, Celtic and Rangers are the moneymakers, and that's why they're so powerful within the league and why there was potential for them to move away. How do you find covering all of Scottish football as opposed to just them two? Because obviously they're going to bring in the money, obviously they're going to bring in the clicks, but if you're covering Scottish football, you need to cover the whole thing.
Sure. I think what we've found at Pure Football is that it hasn't necessarily been the case for us that our coverage of Celtic or Rangers gets more, clicks or views or listens or whatever than the other stuff. And I think that's partly because we would respect the fact that there's a wide range of very professional fan-led media now for both of those teams that basically gives, what those fans would want. And I think that's where the clicks would be for that kind of stuff. We wouldn't kind of go chasing those kind of clicks or listens or whatever. And plus, it's just not, we want it to be fun for us. We want to put out the kind of content we want. So that's kind of first aspect to that we would say, don't chase the clicks, do what you want to do, and respect the fact that probably the fans will go to the source that they want. And also that, a certain segment of the audience will probably come to us for the fact that we are kind of balanced and don't hunt those things. So, in terms of covering the game itself and its kind of intensity, and, you and I spoke about the fact that there's kind of a lot of crazy stories. I was thinking about that earlier today, and I think sometimes I think, the world is full of weird characters and football is just a kind of intense tribal type of thing. So surely people in every single country think that their football is particularly intense and particularly crazy. And then I worry, do we in Scotland focus on that aspect of things out of some sort of inferiority complex about our football? Like, yeah, okay, some of the match action isn't that great, but look at all this daft stuff that happens. But then I was thinking about it more about the kind of actual specific kind of stories and people and instance, and just, these things are hilarious and ridiculous, and there can be a balance of respecting and enjoying the actual football, but also noting all the crazy stories. I mean, just looking over the last few months, you've got at the start of March, Motherwell manager Graham Alexander kind of sounding like a UK government cabinet minister in his post-match interview as he responded to the same question about his own sending off 3 times in a row with the same non-answer. And then in February, you've got Hamilton Accies dispensing with the services a co-commentator they'd hired for their pay-per-view TV after he said on air that he'd been delayed coming back to analyse the second half because, in his words, he'd had to go and squeeze out a jobby at half-time. In January, of course, Celtic in Dubai, and we'll kind of quickly gloss over that one, but that was quite a story. And then before that, in December, we had George Galloway travelling up to Scotland from England, deliberately breaking travel restrictions to go to a Queen of the South match at a time when fans weren't allowed on the ground. So that's just a tiny handful of things in a very small period of time. And I think, it's all part of the charm of the game here. And I guess for me, being cynical and rational about it, I guess it provides quite a lot of content for podcasts and Pure Football,
Yeah, well, I mean, the Irish League would be quite like that as well, League of Ireland. And you're talking another step down in quality, I suppose, in the thing. But there's so many bizarre, hilarious, brilliant stories that come from the league that it makes it really entertaining for the fans. And I mean, like, I'm going to be honest, I've sort of fell out of Scottish football for a while, but I've gotten really into it over the last couple of years again. And there's something brilliant about it compared to watching the Premier League. It's completely different to watching the Premier League because the Premier League's so serious and everything's so shiny and perfect and corporate. Whereas I think that Scottish football, maybe down to the fact that it hasn't been taken over by conglomerate companies, and that is to its detriment on the world stage in terms of European qualifications or whatever, but it has maintained the sort of magic of the early 2000s to late noughties as well compared to the Premier League.
Sure. I would agree with that. That level of authenticity and maybe the closeness between the players and the fans that maybe doesn't exist in the likes of the English Premier League. I agree, and
in terms of the stats, and one of the reasons I got in touch with you was because you had liked a couple of things on the Huddle Breakdown, the podcast that I do. with Alan Morrison and Jaco James. You guys do a lot of that as well, a lot of in-depth analysis and that kind of work in pure football as well. How did you get into that?
Yeah, well, I absolutely love the stuff you're doing at Huddle Breakdown. It's really great to watch and listen to really kind of detailed, in-depth analysis. I guess in terms of how I kind of got into that side of things, I think I'm just the sort of person that maybe values having more and better information, particularly when I'm making decisions. And that's true in my day job. It's probably true in my personal life, maybe to the frustration of my wife that, when she's maybe suggesting we do or buy something, I immediately fire off 10 questions. How would this work? Have you considered a knock-on effect of this? What would happen if blah, blah? And ultimately, I guess my view on it is just that stats, advanced stats data, it's all just information, and analytics is just kind of ensuring that it's better information than what you had previously or what your competitors might have, and then being able to make informed, smarter decisions as a result, and maybe in football giving yourself a competitive advantage. And that's kind of my general view on it, and that's maybe why it's attractive to me. In terms of me kind of getting into advanced football stats or football analytics, I think, as with a lot of people, the Football Manager game probably started that off for me a little bit a long time ago. So I'd imagine, thinking back, I was probably questioning the benefits of things like assists in the game, as a piece of information, given that what an assist is can vary so much from instance to instance. You could be setting somebody up for a tap in, or you could just have passed it off 40 yards out and then they've gone on an amazing dribble and then scored themselves. So, I was thinking, how does this reward the guy who set up the chance as well if the chance is missed, and so on. And I remember Football Manager had a metric of key passes quite early on. So kind of got into that. And then I think I was trying to compare players in the game by breaking things down per 90 minutes. And that kind of helped me think about that. And then I was maybe thinking, well, actually, there's also a benefit to people being available and playing a lot of minutes. So, just breaking it down per 90 doesn't necessarily give you all the answers. And then these things led me on to thinking about expected assists and all that kind of stuff. And then in I think it would have been January 2018, December, January 2018, I was working a job that meant I didn't really have any time off around Christmas, and but my wife did. So she was away seeing her parents for Christmas for a couple of weeks, and I had at the same time got hold of some Scottish Premiership data. So I had a bit of time on my hands, basically. I had to play around with the data, made some radars, did some writing and stuff. And then that led on to doing some bits and pieces at Pure Fitbaw, kind of on that side of things. Then in the summer of 2018, I pitched StatsBomb an article about Andres Iniesta, one of my kind of favourite players of all time. But Spain were going to the Russian World Cup, and I kind of felt, that there was going to be some problems for Spain in that competition, with maybe the reliance on players like him who were maybe hitting a decline. And that article was well received. I then went on to write a few more things for them over the next 18 months or so. And as a result of doing those articles, as well as getting paid for them, the big bonus for me was I got access to their sort of toolkit, their kind of dashboard and advanced data on players and teams, which was just really nice to play around with. So I guess, to kind of close off there, I don't really have the mind or the interest to learn to do things like code or like build models or anything like that. My interest is more about analyzing information, asking questions, trying to explain complex things to people, spotting trends, finding out root causes, thinking about solutions. That's the kind of reason that I like stats and data, not because it's data or not because it's stats, but because it's information, and it can help you improve, I guess.
Yeah, and when I started the Huddle Breakdown, I had no idea about advanced stats. I was actually quite on the cynical side of things in terms of you watch football with your eyes and no more. But since I've started it, I've learned a lot more about the data analytics and the stats involved and what they mean and understanding them. And I think the key thing to point out is that they're merely a means to understand what you're actually seeing with your own eyes. And I think people, maybe it's not quite to the extent now where the layperson knows and understands them but once you are able to separate that idea that the data is what is just a measurement of what you're seeing, as opposed to telling you what you're seeing is wrong, And I think I've brought that into some of my other shows that I do talking about football. And I found it hugely helpful in terms of maybe getting rid of some ideas that I actually did have that, or disproving some things that I actually had misjudged when I was watching football, or even just proving what I'm seeing with my own eyes. And I suppose confirmation bias does come into it, but at the same time, if you're able to put an actual fact and analysis to a point you're trying to make, I think it holds a lot more water.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. And I think one of the things you mentioned there about having one of your thoughts disproved by the data in a way is quite a useful thing for us all to kind of experience, to get that sense of, well, actually the way I was thinking about things might not be right. So it can be useful from that perspective. And I think, this kind of comparison of football data as being some sort of insufficient answer to things, and just watching the games being an answer. I've stood alongside people who've watched games and they don't know what they're watching. I'm sure we've all been in a pub next to somebody watching the exact same game as us, and he's shouting stuff at the screen at this particular player, and he's completely, at least in our view, wrong about things. So there's no way that any one kind of frame of looking at things is the kind of be all and end all, but I do think, as you said, that it's information, right? And the more and better information that you have, the more it can help you hopefully understand things. But these individual stats, they're not some sort of silver bullet. Knowing the XG of something isn't an answer to football. It's just a very, very small part of football. And I think also for maybe practitioners or people who try and get other people interested in stats and things like that, it's getting boring having to enter into arguments and stuff, or kind of, I to an extent, I'm not invested in trying to, win an argument that people should care about these things anymore. It's just information. You choose in life what information you want to be able to, kind of do whatever it is you want. If I can use football stats to try and help me improve my understanding of a game, and hopefully maybe help some teams win games and stuff like that, I'm happy with that, But
Yeah.
I guess what we're maybe leaning to there is maybe there's some downsides. And I would say that there are still some downsides in terms of stats. I'll go through maybe a couple of things. So one thing I would say is that unless you're collecting the data yourself, I think you're largely influenced by what the data providers whose data you have access to have deemed as being worthwhile of collecting or presenting publicly. So what I mean by that is that could maybe lead, for example, to a bit of an obsession with expected goals, because they're the kind of metric that's out there that's kind of public. There's a lot of other stuff that happens in a football match that's potentially just as interesting or valuable to know about as expected goals. The other thing is that at the moment we're seeing, I would say, quite a lot of pretty scatter graphs on Twitter with kind of two metrics presented. For example, let's say progressive passes and progressive runs. But I just want to fling. You don't want to get into. It's good to see people creating content, and you want to encourage people to kind of grow and stuff. And I don't particularly want to use my Twitter to kind of call out things or anything like that. But what I would say at times with those things is, are you just trying to, I don't know, get internet points for how the stuff looks, or propagandize a particular player? Why are you using those two metrics? Is it just because those are the ones that Scout have? What do those metrics even mean? Like, what is a progressive pass? Do you agree with the definition of progressive pass? Why does one that's 25 yards long matter and not one that's 24 yards?
Mm-hmm.
If that's the measurement of it. Did you watch the passes? What do you really think of them? How much does the team that the person is playing for contribute to the fact that they make loads of those types of passes? I mean, obviously you're going to make more of those if you play for Celtic than if you play for Hamilton Accies or whatever, So, and again, the kind of the downside there that I'm seeing would bring me back to just, what's the purpose of this? To me, the purpose of analytics is to get better information that would give a team a competitive advantage. If you want to use it for internet kind of stuff and so on, that's fine. Fair enough. That's where a lot of people get a lot of starts from things. But I think that we maybe should be more comfortable at throwing raw rocks and stuff, and maybe asking questions of each other. And the other thing I would say around that is that, again, data is just information. So you can see from the rocks I'm kind of throwing at it that maybe the skill of the person analysing and using the information is important.
Mm-hmm.
And the other kind of final potential downside of stats that I just want to mention is that I think we're maybe going to get to a point where clubs just think, oh, well, we use data, that must mean that we're smart and doing things well. But I think, like any information, in the wrong hands, it can be used poorly or even harmfully. So what I'm thinking about and worrying about now is like players getting in trouble for their GPS running data being lower than it should be, or young players. Let's say there's a player on loan from Celtic let's say Hamilton Accies. They don't have any of the ball, but let's say the loan manager at Celtic has set a data KPI of, our players should be getting this number of shots per 90 minutes, and then he doesn't make that, and then maybe he fails out the game. That's obviously a bit of a hyperbolic example, but I just wonder, will this lead to people in effect running football clubs like bad call centers, basically, where they're just kind of looking at numbers and not the context? So that's some of my fears about stats and the downside. But again, it's just information.
Yeah, I'd also add the human aspect to it as well, because obviously I think the key point is here that stats are not the be all and end all. They don't tell the full story all of the time. Like, for example, say Shane Duffy and his personal issues this year, that can't be explained away by stats, or but it does add context to it. And say, for example, a player's he's carrying a knock and he doesn't play as well as you might. The data might reflect that, but you need to take all of these stats. Like you said, it depends on the people who are analyzing these stats and what they're taking into consideration. But you do have to consider the human aspect of things as well. I think that's probably one of the things that people think that stats or statisticians don't do when they're considering them. Let's talk about the football this year then.
Okay.
Because as you mentioned, it has been a bit of a wild season in terms of SPFL, which is saying a lot. Celtic going for the 10 in a row and 23 points behind Rangers after a couple of months of football played and a couple of more left. Neil Lennon has resigned after a lot of pressure. We'll start from the very beginning, and probably a very tough question for you to answer. What in God's name happened Celtic this year?
Yeah, a big mess of lots of different issues, I would say, and so I'm not too surprised at the way that the season has played out for Celtic. I guess it's easy to say that. It sounds like with the benefit of hindsight and so on, but I did always think that Lennon was not an ideal appointment for Celtic from when it happened in this period. I think it was an appointment rooted in sentimentality and maybe a belief in, I guess, what some might term intangible kind of personal characteristics. Though I would say that those personal kind of leadership qualities they're not intangible. They can just maybe be tough to assess from the outside. But what I would also say is that I was even back then a wee bit skeptical about Lennon's possession of particularly positive qualities in terms of those things like man management, communication, leadership, development of players and stuff like that. And I think, also at a time when the game is changing, both on and off the park, quicker than ever. So it was always a wee bit concerned for Celtic about that appointment, how that might play out. And I think for Celtic, in addition to that, and the probable tactical and player development issues that I felt the appointment of Lennon might lead to, felt to me like Celtic's recruitment strategy is very incoherent. So players coming in with a lack of clarity as to who really wanted them, players being picked for transfer in with a certain formation or system in mind, and then maybe a switch away from that setup. The continued reliance upon the loan market in a way that almost no other dominant team in a comparable league in Europe is. And I think also the lack of a plan around how to retain assets and make sure that you sell them on at the right, most beneficial time for the club. I'm thinking like Frimpong leaving kind of semi-suddenly, and also the prospect of Ayer and Edward and so on this summer. Anyway, all those things sort of at the same time as Rangers maybe sort of actually figuring out a way and a need to handle those kind of things, and actually having themselves a bit more of a coherent structure, both in terms of on the pitch style of play and recruitment and kind of club setup to support that off the pitch. So that kind of, collision of a sort of set of bad choices and a bit of a kind of regression and decline and stagnation at Celtic, along with a bounce forward for Rangers, kind of has, in my view, kind of contributed to the way things have played out.
I haven't watched much of Rangers this year, to be quite honest, mainly because, sometimes they're playing the same time, sometimes they're playing the same day as Celtic are. Have they improved to the extent where it should be this big of a gap? Because it seems like, well, Steven Gerrard, by all accounts, could have been sacked last season if the season wasn't called short. And it just seems like if Celtic played to the best of their ability, then they still would have been slightly ahead of Rangers. But maybe I'm misconstruing that.
Yeah, I think you are. I think that the idea that Gerrard would have been sacked last season, I think that's really not true. I think that's kind of maybe rooted in unrealistic expectations that maybe some fringe Rangers supporters would have, that he must win a trophy, and that's leveled at clubs all over the world. I'm thinking here of Pochettino at Spurs and so on. Not to compare Gerrard and Rangers to them, but there can be progress, incremental progress, without necessarily the sign of a trophy. Mm-hmm. Winning a League Cup, to me, is inferior to putting plans together and having the right recruitment that means that potentially next season you would win the league. So I think within Rangers there would be a lot more rationality about Gerrard's achievements over the course of last season and so on. I think a lot of the idea that he was maybe in danger of losing his job would be pushed by the lunatic fringe of Rangers fans that have too high expectations, and maybe some Celtic fans with a little bit of kind of trolling or kind of provocative kind of stuff. In terms of how they've done, I think, the measure for me really again is about kind of incremental progress and seeing the process that results in what's happening. So I think Gerrard has set up a style of play and a system that is clear. Everybody knows what they're doing. It doesn't change much from week to week, which again I think is quite a distinction from how things have been at Celtic throughout the season, where there's maybe a little bit of lack of clarity about whether it'll be a 3-5-2, a 4-4-2 diamond, 4-2-3-1 throughout the season, even to the extent that when you see the team lineup on a Saturday, you might not necessarily be sure as a fan what the system is. That's different at Rangers, and you can see that on the part too. Everybody appears to know their role, and it's quite the system they're playing is maybe a system that doesn't rely so much on singular individual quality of players. It's functional, and I don't mean that as a kind of disrespect. There's an idea of how they want to play, how they want to make chances, and it's effective. And they've also been able to translate that to Europe. I think that's been another positive for Gerrard and Rangers, where maybe thinking back to Brendan Rodgers now, a difficulty was for Brendan Rodgers was how do you translate this possession-heavy style that works superbly in the Scottish Premiership and dominates teams, but when you go and have to face an RB Salzburg or Valencia or whatever in Europe, how do you flip that around to win? Whereas for Gerrard, I think the style they've picked allows them to not have to adapt so much in Europe, and that's maybe how they've progressed. So I say all that to say that, I think he's done very well, and the way that they've set up both off the pitch and on the pitch merits where they are, but certainly Celtic could be a lot closer, for the reasons that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, well, I think Rangers or even Celtic, I know Celtic didn't do well at all in Europe, and that's one of the failures of this season. Doing well in Europe is good for Scottish football as a whole, regardless of who you support, because of what it does to the UEFA rankings. So in terms of the functionality is quite a funny word to use, because I think the last couple of weeks I've been saying to Juco, James and Alan that functionality is what I would take at Celtic at the minute. I would take a functioning system that makes sense, because that's something that Celtic didn't have at all this season under Neil Lennon, and hopefully they might get back to that under John Kennedy until the end of the season. And in terms of Celtic and their squad, so like you mentioned, Jeremy Frimpong is gone. There's a strong likelihood that Christopher Ayer will be gone at the end of the season. Cal McGregor's future's up in the air, as is Ryan Christie's. Alton Edouard is almost 100% out of the club. And at the minute, I think for a lot of Celtic fans, they're staring into the abyss until a new manager comes along. What are your thoughts on the future of Celtic and what way they should go about it?
I feel really concerned for Celtic. Maybe not the kind of best news, but I really think that the rebuild and the restructure in the summer is going to be massive. I think that there's just, all over the pitch due to, like you said, these assets that may be leaving, but also the use of the loan system. It's going to be really unclear. I think it might be a depressed market in terms of buyers. So, like, if you are having to sell Owen Edouard, will you get anywhere near the amount of money that really he's worth? And it might be a slow moving market as well. So not only will the fees be smaller, maybe you don't get bidders till right at the end of the transfer window, and then you're again in this potential situation of having to rely on the loan market and stuff like that to get people in quickly. And beyond that, also positionally, it's not just like adding depth or fringe players. Potentially, there's a question mark over a goalkeeper. We don't really know what's going to happen with Barkas. I guess the hope, for me at least, looking at it objectively for Celtic, is that Kennedy takes this as an opportunity to integrate pieces for next season, and kind of have people like Barkas, who potentially should be the goalkeeper for next season, back in. But then you've got like centre back where Julian was a very significant injury. Obviously, you hope that he comes back as the same sort of player, but it might be some time. We don't know. And you potentially only have Ayer then as your senior centre back. I would make Ayer captain and try and get him on an extension. That would be my strategy with him. I think you don't want to lose him and the other guys like Edouard this summer if you can avoid it, and that's maybe the way you win him around. I don't think there's any way to win Edouard around, probably, but Ayer maybe. He's got a kind of link to the city now, right? He's been here for a considerable amount of time. He seems happy and so on. So that would be one approach. But yeah, right through the team, there's loads of kind of issues, and beyond that as well. Obviously, we don't know who the manager is going to be, and it's going to maybe be a closed pre-season for them. So my view is that there's lots of names doing the rounds for Celtic in terms of manager, but whoever it comes in, it might not be for a while. They might be waiting to see, does somebody in the English Championship get sacked at the end of the season, become available? Then you've got the Euros to contend with when people are maybe not available to negotiate. Players might want to wait and see what their future is. So it's all very squeezed, I think, basically. And I think it's going to be very difficult. And I think that if the worst thing about this for Celtic, I think, is that there's a hell of a lot of work to do. But if you don't get it right, it can impact for the next, 3 to 5 seasons potentially. This is, and maybe people might see that differently. I know that people, obviously Celtic fans, would have a different view of the squad than I would, and I do think that there's a load of quality in it. There's obviously great players who are capable of winning trophies, but it just seems like a very big job to me that all these things are kind of arriving at once. So yeah, tough, I think.
Yeah, the loan system's an interesting one because Celtic have a bizarre, crazy amount of loans at the minute. And in terms of Scottish football as a whole, and maybe focusing on Celtic, are they being undercut in terms of transfers? Because my view would be that 13 million, yeah, that's a decent enough price for Jeremy Frimpong, but are you getting 20 million for him if you're playing in another European league? The likes of Virgil van Dijk, the fee that he went for, and then you look at what he went on to do. It just seems like for a club with the brand size of Celtic, they should be doing a lot better in terms of the players that they're selling.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think, we have to be realistic about it, that, it is Scottish football. People are going to put whatever the opposite of a premium would be on that. But I think Celtic are doing reasonably well, or did seem to be, like, for example, with Tierney, at demanding what would seem to be, in my view, probably reasonable figures. You can't expect to get the same sort of money that a Premier League team in England is going to pay another Premier League team for one of their players. There's no point comparing it to somebody like Aaron Wan-Bissaka, for example, who's a young established Premier League fullback and so on. So I don't know. It's hard to balance that out. There's not necessarily enough transfers that happen to really say definitively this isn't fair. We're not getting enough. But yes, I would love for our clubs, not just Celtic, but other ones, to get better fees for the players. The thing I would level though at Celtic, and I think they've done well with Tierney. Tierney was a really good example of developing a player and doing really well, and then maybe allowing him to go at the right time and getting a reasonable fee for him. With somebody like Frimpong, it's been a mess for him in terms of his development and trying to make the most of that asset. He's been in and out of the team. He's been played at right wing. He's been played at right wing back. He's been played at right back. He left in January, kind of, suddenly. So you're not playing the game well enough there. You've got to develop him. When he came in, the first few games, I know he's got deficiencies and he's a lot to learn, but I was thinking, look, potentially, could this guy end up going for more than Tierney, if with the right kind of developments on? He's got the pedigree, and obviously he's gone to a place, there's suitors, right? Bayer Leverkusen is a great place to go to. But you need to invest the time, you need to develop the people, you need to then sell them at the right time when you can create some sort of auction.
Mm-hmm.
And I would bring that back to the likes of Ayer, for example, and Edward. So Chris Ayer, just as a very basic example, Chris Ayer is not left-footed. He's not a left-sided centre-back, but he always plays left-sided centre-back at Celtic to accommodate the fact that the recruitment is messy and poor, and they've not really bought in somebody for that position. But because he's the most capable and experienced centre-back and is probably happy to do whatever the manager wants, he's always the guy that moves over there. Or similarly, he gets moved out to right-back in some European games for whatever idea. These things. And I understand, obviously, the team's got to come first, and results are important, and you've got to do what you can to win football matches. But you've also got to get your hat on in terms of what are we doing to develop these people to make sure that when we sell them, which is inevitable, he's not going to be a player like Ayers is not going to be at Celtic for 15 years. How are we maximising the player and then what we get for them? So that would be something I would level back at Celtic. Not getting enough, but they could do more.
Yeah, and I think that comes into who they get in and the director of football and the transfer policy and how all of this ties together in a workable system that the manager, director of football, the coaches are all getting the best out of the players that they have in order to make everything a success. And one of the reasons that it hasn't really worked out for Celtic this year is that they're selling the players, but they're not replacing them. They're replacing them with loans. Like Bolingoli was seen as the replacement for Tierney, but then that went kaput and they had nobody there. Jeremy Frimpong is gone. They have nobody there, so they had to get John Joe Kenny in on loan. Lack's also on loan. Shane Duffy was a loanee that's coming in to fill a position that they didn't have enough depth in because they didn't recruit properly. So that all needs to play all as one workable system for it to be successful, and that's probably why it hasn't worked out for Celtic this year. In terms of Scottish football as a whole, I mentioned earlier, fantastic news, especially for an Irishman who wants someone to support at the Euros next year. Scotland are at the Euros this year. Finally has come around. I'd imagine you're absolutely buzzing to actually see Scotland in a major tournament again.
I sure am. Yeah, I think it's just fantastic to be there. Really hope it does still go ahead, and ideally in a situation where some fans can get together in some way to enjoy it. I think we should be really proud of qualifying. I think that obviously it's been a long time coming, but we need to be realistic about that. It's getting tougher and tougher, I think, to qualify for international tournaments for countries like us. We don't have some sort of natural birthright to be there, despite having been football nations for a while. There's more countries now, with the breakup of maybe the Balkan countries and so on, and lots of other countries are getting better in terms of their infrastructure, their production of young players and so on. So I think we should take pride in the fact that we've gone there, and also I think we should take pride in the fact that maybe the reasons that we've managed to get there are evident. Like, it's not just luck. We've got a system of play in place. We've got a manager who's capable. He's set up a kind of smaller kind of club type feel in terms of selection pool. And an issue for me I've always had with Scotland is just handing out caps to too wide a field of players, and it's just kind of there's a lack of continuity, or maybe players not getting the amount of caps they should have till an older age. I'm thinking of people like Cal McGregor, for instance. You need to have these people. These people who are going to be the key good players in and playing early and kind of building up that kind of team feel. So yeah, I'm delighted. I'm really looking forward to it. Just happy to be there and very hopeful that we don't get an absolute doing off England.
That's the main thing. Yeah, Steve Clarke's an interesting one, and Scotland has a lot of similarities to Ireland in many ways, in terms of the league structure and almost the lack of a youth league for youth teams to develop, or that sort of centralized system that the bigger countries can afford to put in place and can afford to put 10 years of their football aside. Steve Clarke as well, a manager who I think Scotland went through a run of managers there where it was the managers who would come in and be big names, or at least men who had experience in Scottish football. But Steve Clarke is a completely different man in terms of he's a manager that understands systems. And I think that was really important for Scotland, especially with the whole Andy Robertson, Kieran Tierney, how do you get both them into the side at the same time as well. Yep. But aside from that, Cal McGregor is someone that I wanted to ask you about. He's been hit or miss for Celtic this year. I'd say mainly down to the position and the role that he's asked to do for Celtic. What's his role at Scotland at the minute?
Sure. Well, Scotland have tended to play, I guess you would maybe say it's a 5-2-3 or like a 3-4-3 type system, where McGregor would be one of the two central midfielders, often being the kind of left-sided central midfielder. And generally, it's felt to me that he's maybe the one that's more tasked with being on the ball, the build-up play, the kind of ball carrying, the creative stuff, while maybe the other part of that pivot is maybe been Ryan Jack, who's maybe been more responsible for kind of winning the ball back and, kind of turning it over and stuff like that. And I think McGregor's done well. I think that the weight of expectation of what McGregor can do, or what a central midfielder should do, is to me a little bit unfair at times. I mean, you can't kind of expect a central midfielder necessarily to be doing everything. People, I think, would expect him to be bursting forward. I mean this for Scotland generally, and getting loads of assists or loads of goals. But there's so much responsibility in that kind of system in terms of being the central midfielder. You've got to pick up the ball from the back three. You've got to be ready to win the ball back. You've got to hold your shape positionally to fill the space. So I think people just need to be realistic about their expectations, both of him and both of that kind of position and role. I'm a big fan. I would put that front and center, that I really, really like him as a player. I think in terms of somebody that can find space, move into space, use the ball, keep the ball, play nice passes. That's the sort of player I really like. So, this is one of my confirmation biases, as we spoke about earlier. I probably need some information, some data to challenge me on him a wee bit. But I really like him. I think that hopefully the games latterly in the qualification process, particularly a game against Serbia, I would think that game really showed to people the level of player he is, because against a team that have very good midfielders and have skilled players, he was a key part of us keeping the ball and playing it about and making smart passes and making them work and spread things. So as much as expectations are massive of him, I think he's doing okay. I think he's doing fine. Just maybe we need to temper the expectations and not expect multiple assists in a game. And just that the other thing I guess to consider is to think of it as a system. Like you said, Steve Clarke, it's a system game. The individual cogs, the 11 guys, they can do their job without seeming spectacular. The key is to kind of win the games and get through. And I think he's good at that. But it would obviously be lovely if he popped up in the Euros and got us a lovely through ball for Griffiths to tuck away against England or something. Yeah. That'd be ideal.
Yeah, well, I love Cal McGregor. I think he's a fantastic player. And if you look at Celtic's team, to bring it back to Celtic, with a spine of Christopher Ayer, Cal McGregor, David Turnbull, and fair enough, Odson Edouard may not be there, but for example, he is there. That's an incredibly gifted spine of a team that you can build around in terms of the squad. So I hope to see Conor McGregor back to his best for Celtic next season, hopefully. And just to finish off on Scotland, then, if you were to hazard a guess of how you're going to do, or at least what are you hoping to do in the Euros? Where are you hoping to get to?
I was being very serious that one thing I want to avoid is being embarrassed against England. I think England have got a phenomenal squad, so that's a thing I'm a wee bit scared about. I think like the third place can potentially go through to the next round, so that's what I want. I think it's realistic given the structure and also the fact that hopefully we have 2 games in Glasgow, so maybe a bit of home support and lack of travel. That's what I want. Get to the knockouts. That would make me happy.
Well, if Ireland can do it at France and almost beat the French team that won the tournament, then I think Scotland will have a pretty good chance. Owen, thanks for joining me today. You've been brilliant with your time and really enjoyed the chat.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate you having me. Great.